This is the first interview with Herb Pomeroy. It's December 14th, 1999, in the Lewis Music Library, interviewed by Forrest Larson. I'm delighted to have with me today Herb Pomeroy, who was director of jazz bands at MIT from 1963 to 1985, and also sitting in is Fred Harris, who's director of wind ensembles at MIT currently, and also director of the various jazz ensembles here as well. I'm Forrest Larson. It's December 14th, 1999, and we're in the Lewis Music Library. Thank you, Herb, for coming. It's very generous of you.
My pleasure. It's being on the campus again reminds me of that long span of my life. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, tell me about your early musical experiences with your family. I know that your mother was a musician. Just talk about real early stuff.
I was born into a home where my mother, as you just mentioned, had been a professional musician. She was a piano player in the older jazz stride piano style of the 1920s. She had gone to the New England Conservatory as a student. She did not graduate. I think she went there for a couple of years. That was most of her formal training. One teacher that stands out, she always used to mention, was a man named Joseph Dustin. Other than that, I don't know much about her specific training. My dad was a dentist, as was his dad, and there was in our home from the earliest years that I have firm memories, a pulling and tugging, not a serious one, about whether the first son, and actually the only son, I have two sisters, and I have one, two, three, four, including my two sisters, there were 7 grandchildren, and I was the only boy. And so my grandfather, Irving H. Pomeroy Sr., who named his son, my dad, Irving H. Pomeroy Jr., then they together, or I presume the old guy had something to do with it, named me Irving H. Pomeroy III, with the idea that this very dental-oriented family would have someone to carry on. And it was extremely dentally oriented in that my dad's brother, there were 3 siblings. My father had 2 siblings, there were 3 in all. His brother, Richard Pomeroy, was a dentist, as my dad was. And my aunt was a hygienist. She went to Forsyth, one of the very first classes. She is now 102, going to be 103 in March. Yeah. And she's one of those people, she's still in great health, who it looks like she's going to have lived in 3 centuries. She was born in 1897, and she's just a few days away from being in 3 centuries. But she was a hygienist. So then in reading a book that I mentioned to you gentlemen a couple moments ago, with this history of my great-grandfather, who I never knew, who died, I think, right around the turn of the past century turn, there were 9 children there, my grandfather's siblings, and 4 of those 9 were dentists. So it was just dentistry. Now, I am the first male in 3 generations to have broken this non-dental life. So I kind of got a little long-winded about talking about the pulling and tugging. And my mother was a professional musician. When I was young, 3, 4 years old, she would be giving lessons in the house. And my father was very interested in music. He was not a professional musician, but he was an amateur musician, played the clarinet in the local Legion band and things like that, and loved jazz music.
And this was in Gloucester?
In Gloucester, Massachusetts, right. I was born in 1930, so we're talking about let's say the early and mid-30s, that one of my first memories are still, that I can draw upon them. So there was this pulling and tugging, and music was always in the house. My mother would play in orchestras, and they'd come into the house and rehearse. Maybe I started to get my rehearsal techniques developed there when I was 3 and 4. And I can remember seeing the high school ROTC marching band march by the house, and boy, I'd get in the window and look out and watch this thing. So I was intrigued by music from very early and had it all around me. And it was a period where music was very important in people's lives. Now, being the son of a dentist, we didn't suffer during the Depression, during the 30s, in the sense of, coal for the furnace and no food. But times were difficult then, as anybody knows. And music was one of those things that seemed to bring everybody together. And I had a sense that the world around me, by the time I started to go to the first grade in 1936, there were a lot of families in a lot of trouble, but whenever music seemed to come into their lives, it seemed to give them great joy. And to jump way ahead just for a moment, in my early professional years in Boston, the older musicians I played with in the Colonial and the Schubert theaters used to tell me that financially, the greatest period in their professional lives were the years of the Depression, where most people on the streets with their pencils and their apples, and these guys are running 4, 5, or 6 gigs a day. From a radio studio, every radio station had anywhere from a 6 to a 10-piece orchestra, studio band. They'd run from a morning radio show to a rehearsal later morning. To all the Chinese restaurants then had live orchestras at lunchtime, and then they go back to the theater for matinee, and then they come out and they do a radio show at supper, back to the theater, and then play a breakfast dance at midnight. And these men were making $500, and you know what $500 was worth in the 30s. More than they ever made later after inflation to be back in. Again, I'm digressing, but this thing that music has to bring people to, I saw, or bring people together and bring them to. I saw this as a very young person. I can remember getting up before my parents would get up in the morning. This is preschool age when I was maybe 5. And we had one of those old-fashioned radios, and I'd go, and there was a radio station that I had been able to find, and I don't know if I even knew the number, but I knew how it looked on the dial. And at about 5 o'clock, when they would play marches, and somehow I got hooked on this martial swing, so to speak. And I didn't know it at the time, but there was one march that I loved. It was called El Capitan.
Oh, yeah.
And you know the march?
Yeah, right.
That starts out in 6/8, and then when it goes into the trio section, into 2/4, it is swinging.
Yeah.
Not like a jazz swing, but that's
Yeah.
and at 5 years old, I'm there, not supposed to be up with my ear in this radio. Listen to this 6/8 going to 2/4. Now I had no idea it was 6/8 going to 2/4, but I'm saying, oh, is this lovely? So I was surrounded by it at these early ages. Then the typical negatives started. My mother started giving me piano lessons, and I didn't want my mother teaching me piano or anything like at all, and we were very unsuccessful. So she then sent me to another teacher. Or to another teacher beside herself, and I think I was the only boy there, and there were probably 8 or 10 girls, and they were older than me. I say I was 7, okay, and I can distinctly remember hating this situation. And there would be the annual Christmas party, and they would play games, and to be able to take part in the games, there would be numbers games, and it would require knowing long division and multiplication. I'm in the second grade, and I'm just getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these girls were so PO'd that I was causing the teacher to bring this game that they could do in long division back to just numbers, you know. So I had all these reasons for not wanting to be there. I didn't want to be playing the piano, and that didn't last very well. It was when I was 11 that the thing really happened to me, and this place is 1941. I was in about the 5th grade in school, and I went to see a movie. My mother, because my mother all this time, as she's pushing, I think she wanted to vicariously live through my music, which she claimed that I was the reason that she claimed she played professionally until she was 7 months along in her pregnancy with me, playing with a shawl, and she said that's why I got my good time. And when I went with Lionel Hampton's band, I helped you be able to go with this Lionel Hampton band. She said, when I've been playing on the piano bench at 7 months pregnant with you. So she was always pushing, and she took me to, my father used to go deer hunting early in December every year, something I never have gotten into, hunting. But that's a totally different subject matter. And as soon as my father left for this week, he went out to the Berkshires from Gloucester. She'd get me, and we'd go into Boston, and she would rent a room at the Parker House Hotel. And at that time, there were 3 or 4 theaters in Boston with stage shows with bands, like Cab Calloway's band, Xavier Cougart's band. And every night she had me at a different one of these stage show vaudeville, you know, the comedian, the dancer, the flamethrower, whatever it is, the flame swallower, and a good hot band on the stage. And she'd take me to a different one each night. And I remember one time we went to see Cab Calloway one night. And I think, in retrospect, as I've looked at it historically, Dizzy was playing with Cab Calloway at that time. I didn't know that, of course. And then the next night we went to Xavier Cougat, that, you know, South American. And I liked Xavier Cougat better than Cab Calloway. And my mother was furious. You're not supposed to like this better than that. You're supposed to like that jazz music.
Right.
So she pushed. And in this particular fall of 41 visit to Boston for a week while my dad was away hunting, we went to see a movie. And Louis Armstrong was in the movie. And I got hooked. I said, I want one of those. I had really been diddling. I hadn't taken piano lessons for, say, 4 years. I would play my father's clarinet in the cellar, just taught myself the fingerings. And all of a sudden, whether it was because I was now old enough to understand more than I was when she was pushing me at age 7, I said, I want one of those. The next day, she had the local high school band director bring a trumpet to the house to get to buy a trumpet for me. And there it was. I was age 11, 5th grade, I guess. Maybe 6th grade. No, it was the 6th grade. And the trumpet in my hand, and this old Italian bandmaster. He had been in the Italian Army band in World War I in Italy, and came to the States and became a tailor, and then became active locally in Gloucester and was the director of the high school ROTC band. And from that point on, it just, I ran with it, it ran with me. Fred will love to hear this. It was within 4 or 5 months, I was leading my first band.
Wow.
You could see what was on the horizon. And we'd get half a dozen grammar school kids and call them up, and we'd tell them we had these books where all C instruments play, all E flat, all B flat, those kind of things. Playing Lieberstrom, or the band played on, or some of these really funny little tunes. We weren't playing Bird Gets the Worm or anything like that at that point. But and then playing in the junior high school orchestra, junior high school band, and an interesting thing happened. I have a very unusual embouchure, unusual in the sense of bad. Maybe nobody has ever gone as far in their career as a trumpet player with the embouchure that I have. But anyway, I was quite ill in the 7th grade. By now, I've got my own band. I'm playing grammar school assemblies and graduations and little weddings and all this stuff in the 7th grade with this funny little band, which my mother was the rhythm section. She played piano, and we had 2 trumpets, 2 clarinets, and a trombone. Funny instrumentation, playing out of these little funny music books.
Did the band have a name?
I guess it was the Herb Pomeroy Orchestra already.
Wow.
I don't know if we did have a name. I was the band leader. I was giving orders. Beyond that, I don't know whether I guess we did.
I'm sorry. I'm fascinated. Can you recall maybe what was in you that felt as though, well, I could in fact lead, and obviously the music was strong enough in you, even that music, that something kind of felt, well, I want to, control this to a certain extent, or something.
Ooh, that word is a great word. I hope that wasn't the control aspect, but it probably is. I've always, until I retired from Berkeley and in 1995 and disbanded my own professional band for good in 1993, I was always very good at organizational details, organizational people, and then I'm comfortable saying organization of their talents within each person and bringing them together. And somehow that was probably a part of me not really knowing it, I think that original thing, though, on forming the band had to do with it. My mother was this piano player, and she was, I mean, I did the organizing, the phone calls and all that stuff, and going to the music stores, but she, being an adult and a respected professional musician, playing piano for us, so they're going boom, chick, that was the rhythm section. No drums, no bass, just piano was the rhythm section. I think her presence, her existence on the scene, so to speak, allowed me to become the leader.
That's great.
Wow. Going back just a little bit, tell me about some of the local music in Gloucester when you're growing up. You mentioned some town bands and stuff like that. Tell me about some of that.
Well, there was the Gloucester Legion Band. There was the Rockport, the adjacent town to Gloucester Legion Band. There were some pretty good swing-oriented dance band activity prior to World War One. Let's say the musicians started to really be drafted after Pearl Harbor. So let's say up through 41, I was aware of, my mother would take me to dances where my memory is there was pretty good dance band music. I was not involved at all. Then we get to the point where I'm in high school, a freshman in high school in 1944, and most of the professional musicians of that era, at least the ones from 18 to 40 or whatever the particular age, were in the service. So I had a very unusual positive opportunity. I was playing professionally with adults at age 14. that would not have happened if it hadn't been in wartime. It drained the supply of early young and early middle-aged musicians. So there was this activity. By the time I was a junior in high school, and it was one of the reasons that my folks took me out of high school and sent me to prep school away from Gloucester after my junior year, I was playing 7 nights a week. I was still maintaining my grades. I was an A-B student at Gloucester High School, but I can remember the pattern of the week. The Monday night would be the Gloucester Legion Band. Tuesday night we had a high school dance band led by a local postman who was floor rap, who was a very good musician. He was the first fellow to teach me arranging. We rehearsed Tuesday nights. It was called the Musical Serenaders, was the name of the dance band. Wednesday night, the Gloucester High School ROTC band rehearsed, which I was remember. Thursday, I would go to Rockport, the next town, and play with the Rockport Legion band. Friday and Saturday, generally, I would have gigs. You know, the little high school YMCA, local teen canteen type $5. We'd make $5 or $6 a man, you know. And then Sunday night, there was a club in the town of Essex, which is also adjacent to Gloucester, called the Skyway. And that's where my real development took place. I would go to sessions, and this was the first time that I would play with musicians outside of the Gloucester circle of musicians. Now I'm playing with the North Shore guys, the Beverly Salem Limb, which is really a step up the ladder as far as these people were really jazz musicians, whereas the Gloucester people, most of them were at best competent dance band musicians. Now I was reaching out into adult jazz world. So I was playing 7 nights a week in these circumstances.
Wow.
Yeah. And it would not have happened if it hadn't been for my, coincidentally, my time thing, being that it was during the war.
Now, you mentioned the high school bandmaster, this Italian gentleman.
Yes.
Were you taking lessons from
I
him?
was. Very, when...
And what was his name?
His name was Anthony Gentile, Gentile, and we all call him Tony Gentile. There's a bandstand at a glorious park in Gloucester called Stage 4 Park, which is high up above the harbor and looks over the harbor. And I was appointed on a committee back in the mid-'80s by the mayor to be part of the committee, an ad hoc committee, to build a bandstand in his memory. And I play there a Sunday night every summer with my group, with John Laporte and myself, Donna Byrne, and our rhythm section. And it's a very strong experience for me because it's in Gloucester, and all my friends, and then this my initial teacher is name point and dedicated. But he was purely a martial type, martial music. He did play in local dance bands, but he was very, very stiff rhythmically. He just understood the world of marching music and played very well. But he was my first trumpet teacher, and I started with him right after that Louis Armstrong movie. Mother brought him, and he brought the trumpet, a Boucher trumpet, cost $100. I remember that. All these came from Carl Fisher's music store here in Boston, and this Tony Gentile, who spoke quite broken English, he referred to Carl Fisher as Carla de Fish. I got the trumpet at Carla de Fish, he said. And I studied with him until probably about a year and a half, until in the 7th grade, I had a 4-month period of being ill. They tell me they almost lost me. Some viral thing that they didn't understand back in the early 40s, like they probably do now. But I was out of school for 4 months. I was in bed for 2 and then recuperating for another month at home. And then my grandfather, who used to winter in Florida, I spent a month with him. And this is in the 7th grade. So I stopped studying with this Tony Gentile actually from the point when I became ill until I went to audition for the high school band. And it was in this period, from middle 7th grade until auditioning going into 9th grade, where totally unbeknownst to me, my embouchure, which started with him in the center, symmetrically, slipped over to the left. See, I found this place between the eye tooth here where I could get a great grip, okay? But it slipped in a totally non-symmetric way, and it's still here now 100 years later. I play out of the side of my top lip and the center of my bottom lip. So I'm like this when I play, which means if I don't play a lot and keep in shape, this side, the seal, and actually our lips have to be sealed, or the air, my seal breaks very easily on this side because I've got this screwed up thing here. And if I play a physically hard, a Ted Herbert gig, playing second or third trumpet parts on Ted Herbert's dance band, but with a lot of hard blowing, at the end of the gig, the knot of my necktie is damp from all the dribble that has come down over my chin onto this knot. I mean, I'm giving you a lot of, side details, but you've asked for it.
Yeah, certainly.
So I was auditioning for the high school band, and this has happened. And now I'm playing for an 8th grader pretty well, So I got to the audition, and he said, "What happened to you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look at your lips." He said, "They're all messed up." Oh, how did he say? He said, "You're not going to play trumpet in the band next year. You play mellophone in the band your freshman year. Forrest, you know the mellophone parts, and pop and pop and pop and pop, And he said, then, beginning of sophomore year, we'll go back to trumpet and we'll fix this all up." Whereas I, who had always been, and still am, a rather pleasant, easygoing person, Fred, I think, will agree, said, now mind you, I've yet to enter freshman year in high school. This is the summer going into freshman year. I said, "I play trumpet better than anybody in your high school band right now." I said, "I think I'm just going to stick with the trumpet." And in retrospect, I can't believe, knowing myself. It may be that's the one place in my life that I'm really proud of myself. Maybe there's some real hidden meaning about what I am as a person here. But I said, okay. Now, I don't know that I was. There was one guy in the band that really played better than me. His name was Dick Morrow, and we were good friends. We played together a lot. But I just did not want to be, I didn't want to put a year aside. I wanted to keep straight ahead, And by my sophomore year, I was far and away the best trumpet player in the band, because none of them were very good, actually. Wasn't I was that good. But I remember that thing about going to this audition and him saying, "What happened? What happened to you?" or however he said it. So he was a very important figure. And then the man who led the high school dance band. This had nothing to do with, it was not an official school activity. It was high school in the sense of we were all high school students. His name was Shorty Perry, Francis, and the nickname Shorty because he was 6'5", a male man who couldn't get in the service for whatever reasons, and very strong influence musically. A dance band musician who loved jazz, but was not a jazz player, but he took... We had this little dance band of kids in high school on our own. We played at the teen canteen, and he walked in there one night, and he listened. He said, "This is the worst thing I have ever heard in my life." He said, "This is terrible." He said, "Would you like me to take you guys over and help you?" And we all said, "Yeah, sure," because he was about 23 and we're 14, 15. He just did marvelous things. He was a fine musician. He wrote an entire book for the band, fitting the instrumentation, the skills, the range limitation.
Wow.
All of our negatives were hidden, our pauses were brought, and it was for a high school band. It was not high school age level band. It wasn't too bad, but he was a strong influence. But that was still mostly dance band. First, the trumpet player with the martial music, then the trombone player. Then, when I got to be about 16 and started to play at these jam sessions on Sundays, then I began to meet the jazz musicians who became very important influences in my development musically.
Did you ever play any classical music during that time?
Not really. No, not more than what we would call concert band music, I would say. Never any symphonic. There was no symphonic type of orchestral playing. Except I played in a brass quartet in the summers. A fellow from Gloucester named Chester Roberts, a wonderful tuba player. Do you know Chet?
Yeah. I know of him.
Yeah. He played in the Pittsburgh and the Cleveland Orchestra under Zell and Fritz Reiner and those people. And in the summer we would play there's a what do we call it? The St. Peter's Fiesta, where they bless the fishing fleet every summer. And we had a quartet with a Shorty Perry playing trombone, Chet playing tuba, and two trumpets. But I wouldn't call it really classical. I mean, it was it was liturgical music and all. But no, not really. No. And as a young person, I have to be honest with myself, I really didn't like classical music. I mean, I was just young and frivolous and wanted to swing and all that sort of stuff. And actually, I learned about it relatively quickly as a young adult. But it was all martial music, dance band music, and then starting to become small group jazz music by the time I was about 16.
Wow. So you didn't have a lot of kind of one-on-one lessons. You were learning a lot from
I did not.
Yeah.
This year and a half with Tony Gentile, this Shorty Perry gentleman gave me arranging lessons. Then in the summer of '48, I left high school after my junior year, having to do with the music activity, and also, maybe this doesn't need to be anything you write down. My high school girlfriend and I were getting very tight, for 17. I mean, this will not be on the written sheet, I hope.
Yeah. Do you want me to? I can turn the tape off if you want.
Well, just, you can, we were very involved, for that, and too involved for that age, okay? Wondering about where's the rabbit and all that sort of stuff, you know. So, my parents whisked me out of Gloucester, which was devastating, because I was very involved with this young woman and had this literally music career going on. And at the end of my junior in high school, that all, my Gloucester music career and my relationship with this young woman, who later became my first wife and had 2 children by her. But I was whisked away to Williston Academy out in the eastern part of the state at Easton. Wonderful school. I didn't want to be there. I can't say that I fought, because I knew that once my father had gone to school there and the whole thing, and I knew I was gone. And I'm telling all this to get us to private lesson situation. It was the best educational experience I've ever had in my life. The 2 years at this prep school were magnificent. I went to Harvard after for 1 year, and my freshman year at Harvard could not compare to it. Granted, if I'd stayed at Harvard, I'm sure my later years there, I would have had contact with wonderful men. But this is a great educational experience, and it didn't take me too many years out of there to look back and realize what I had learned. The level of teaching by these men, who most of them were Ivy League professors who, at age 55 or 60, had enough of the big-time college scene and wanted to go to some little New England town and settle down. And they were marvelous. They were so much more than teachers. They were men and taught me so many values that have been part of my life for my entire life. But I went there had to go 2 years. Even though in Gloucester High School I had been doing well, when I took the entrance exams, I had to repeat my junior year there. And so I actually had 5 years of high school in that sense. Between the 4th and 5th of the 5 high school years, between, let's call it the junior and senior year at Williston, I can remember how it happened. We were driving home from Williston. My father and mother came out to pick me up and my belongings to come home for the summer to Gloucester. And my mother said, "I've been hearing on the radio about this school that combines mathematics and music," she said. Now, I had always been very good in math in high school. And at Williston, I would win the Algebra 2 prizes and the trigonometry. Again, that sort of organizational thing that you need for numbers. And also, at that point, I knew I was pushing away from dentistry, but I was pretty sure it was going to be difficult with the family to go to music. So I was thinking engineering, and matter of fact, this old aunt I was telling you about, who'll be 103 in March, her husband was the chief engineer at the Chicago Stockyards, so my father would take me out there for a week, and we'd watch him engineer, you know. So my mother said, "I heard about this music school, this Schillinger House School of Music," she said. And I was in my ears immediately. Woo! So I called there, and I arranged to take one day a week 3 private lessons, one on trumpet, one on piano, and one on arranging. And so the duration of that summer would come into Boston from Gloucester, and of course the one day takes 3 1-hour lessons, or maybe the trumpet, piano, half-hour lessons. Trumpet player named Fred Behrman, who was the brass instructor at Berkeley, who had been lead trumpet player with Paul Whiteman back in the 20s. This was only the 40s, so that wasn't that large a gap. Piano player who had been Larry Burke, who was the founder of Berkeley. He had a partner in the beginning. His name was Harry Smith, and I studied piano with Harry Smith, and an arranging teacher named Vic Hogan. So I had to this small degree that summer between the junior and senior high school, some one-on-one training in those 3 areas.
And you were studying kind of jazz and popular music, or what?
Yes, I would say with the trumpet teacher, just again studying the instrument. He made no attempt to change the embouchure. And I regret that I didn't go along with the mellophone. You know,
Really?
In hindsight, I could have been a better trumpet player for the rest of my life if I'd done what Tony Gentile wanted me to do in 1944. I regret that Fred, again, he probably heard that I was playing pretty good already and didn't make any change. At age 23, to jump ahead just a bit, I did go to see John Coffey. Do you know the name John Coffey? Mm-hmm. He was a bass trombonist with the Boston Symphony, and one of the great legendary characters of the Boston history of music in Boston. If you ever run into any brass players who ever had anything to do with John Coffey, or if you know a brass player of that era, just say, "Tongue and blow, kid, tongue and blow," and they'll know it. Because John Coffey, no matter what your problem was, he'd say, "Tongue and blow, kid." I went to John at age 23. Now I'm professional, supporting a family in music. And I said, "John, I've got to fix the embouchure," because both range and endurance, there was a limitation because of this terrible thing I've got here and still have to this day. And I would say I lasted about 3 weeks. He didn't want to change me.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I don't resent it or hold against it, but somehow they didn't see clearly enough that this was going to hold me back from my entire professional career, whether they didn't want to bother to get in such a major reconstruction project. I don't know just what. I didn't push hard enough. For some reason, that should have happened then. At any one of these 3 times, entering high school, Fred Behrman at Schilling House in 48 and John Coffey in 53. But what would happen, at this point I was working maybe 4 or 5 nights a week, supporting a wife and 2 children with the trumpet playing. I left Schilling House by this time. And I would practice 2 or 3 hours of the day with this new symmetrical, correct structure. Then I'd go to the gig that night and have to revert to the other one to play the gig. So what I'd accomplished during the day, I would undo. And then I would go back to the lesson the next time, and it wouldn't be very good. And then when I would practice during the day, that would make my playing of the gig less good, and the playing the gig would make the progress I made the first. So after about 3 weeks, John Coffey and I said, the only way you can do that is stop playing professionally for 6 months, and I could not do that at that point, So I kind of jumped ahead there from about 1948 to 53 to talk about the lessons. I forget. You can keep me chronologically in order.
That's fine. Tell me a bit more about the Stillinger House, because that led into the Berkeley College.
It was an enormous part of my life, no question. When I began to study there in 1948, the school was 3 years old. It was then at the corner of Newbury and Gloucester Street, where Charlie's Saloon is now. It was at that point that I went in the summer of 48, as I said, 3 years old. It was only the front building. The buildings on Newbury Street that happened to be on a side street, like Gloucester, there would be about 4 buildings deep from Newbury back to the alley that would go in between Gloucester and Boylston Street there. At this point, it was only the front building. And they were in the process of breaking the walls down that summer to go into the second, and eventually went into the third building. And then he eventually got the building next door and just kept expanding. But it was very small, and it was, I don't know the percentage, but I think it might be safe to say 90% of the students there were people who had been in the service during World War II and were there on the GI Bill of Rights. It had somewhat of a reputation then of being a jazz school. But the truth of the matter is, it was more of like a jazz-oriented dance band school. Now, there were some very fine jazz musicians, for instance, Charlie Mariano, a marvelous jazz alto saxophonist. So I think the school got its reputation in these very early years as being jazz-oriented because of some of the musicians who were students there, more so than the actual teaching there. It really was more like, I might be safe to say there was no real jazz instruction as it would later become to be at the school. But my association that was great there was now I was associating with people 5, 10 years older who many had been on the road and named dance fans and had come back so that they could maybe live at home with their wife and kids and get the income from the GI Bill and go to school or whatever their reasons for being back in Boston. But it was a national student body, even though it was small, I don't know, maybe 100, 150 students, people from all over the country, many of whom had been in service bands or who had been on road, maybe not the major bands, like Ellington or Basie or something like that, but the next level of dance bands that were popular in the 30s and 40s. Some of these men would to learn arranging or just to get off the road. And so I had an association with a number of musicians. There was a band in Boston a piano player by the name of Nat Pierce, who had a band that eventually evolved into my band in the mid-50s. And I was I'd go to all their rehearsals, and I became friendly with a lot of men in the band. And Dave Chapman, who played lead alto in my band right up till 1993, was the lead alto player in that. And Charlie Mariano was the jazz alto player. And a number of people, probably half of the band I formed in 55 had either been regular or substitute members of this Nat Pierce band. So when I was supposed to be at classes at Harvard, I would be over on Washington Street in the terrible part of Boston at a club called the Mardi Gras, listening to this band rehearse and socializing with the guys during the rehearsals and all that. So, but the Schilling House was not what a lot of the outside world thought it was. They thought it was a jazz school, and it was not. And it was called Schillinger House because of Joseph Schillinger, and Larry Burke had been one of Schillinger's disciple, maybe a strong word, student, as Gershwin had and Glenn Miller had, and those are name people, but there are a lot of other composers who came from that.
And there were some classical composers that were quite taken with the Schillinger method.
Yes,
too,
I think
so,
Stefan Volpe was one of them who
Yeah.
I think was involved with that. And I don't know much about it because, truthfully, I would not want to elaborate. When I went to Schillinger House full time, when I left Harvard in spring of 50 and then the fall of 50 went to Schillinger House full time, there was still called Schillinger House School of Music. It was required to take, each semester you would study a various book of this Schillinger's composition system. And it totally turned me off. By that point, my thinking that math and music should come together, I now knew, get rid of the math, or get into the feeling and the emotion and the expression and all that. So drawing all these graphs and grafting them, the climaxes of the melodies and saying the pitch time maximum, meaning the note that the ear hears the most for 8 bars, we'll consider this note. If there's 12 beats of this note in 8 bars of music, we'll call it the pitch time maximum. Anytime the melody goes up and away from it, that will be the primary this, and if it goes down, and the emotional effect you'll get from this, and I'm saying, oh, no, thank you, that's not where I'm coming from. And then the permutation of rhythms, actually, that was one of his things. Oh, permute this, do that. Anyway, the school was very much into that. Larry Burke, I think, he was a very smart businessman and a wonderful man, a dear, warm human being. I think he just sort of saw he could tie the G.I. Bill of Rights, Joseph Schillinger, sort of the mystique of Joseph Schillinger, some jazz orientation, and put it all together into this thing, and he did, and he succeeded just beyond anybody's idea. But I only stayed there for 5 semesters. 5 semesters. Because when I told my dad during my 1 year at Harvard that I was going to leave Harvard, okay, but you're on your own. So now at Schillinger House, I'm paying my own tuition, and I've got a wife and a couple of kids. I was a first child in 51, second one in 53. So I didn't stay there to get they weren't even granting a degree at that point. It was just a diploma school at that point. More important to me then, and I'm going to say it, but hopefully the powers that be at Berkeley won't hear it. It was more important then, and it's the same now. What you get out of Berkeley is not what you get in the classroom as much as it is the environment that you live in. And every minute of it you can play, and meeting people who have played, and that it almost should be called an environmental college in that sense, rather than music college. And I've said this publicly and on radio interviews and things. I know they're thinking, that son of a gun, he spent 40 years here, and now he's saying these things. But I believe them more every day that I live, unfortunately, that you can't teach this kind of music. You can teach the instrument, you can teach specific facts, but music is so non-factual that it's a very hard thing to teach. And I get loads of wonderful arguments in that. So I was a part of that environment for 5 semesters. Learned more about arranging from getting scores. This fellow Nat Pierce I speak of, he wrote for Woody Herman's band in the early 50s and for Count Basie. And whenever he came back to town, we were good friends. I'd say, give me some of these scores. I learned more about arranging from studying scores of existing music that were written for the name bands than I ever learned from any arranging class. And there used to be some pretty good stock arrangements of the Basie and the Gillespie bands, and I would take these and transfer those parts back to concert so I could study them. And that was my real learning process as far as arranging. Not to put down, so to speak, the arranging classes, but they were not going in the direction. They were still dance band oriented. They really were.
Were there ensembles there, or was it mostly classes?
No, the ensemble was a large part of it. And my first contact with Joe Viola, marvelous saxophone teacher, really considered one of the great saxophone teachers of the world. He would lead student ensembles, and I would play under him. And he was not a jazz musician, just a marvelous saxophonist, but he understood jazz. And when he would lead ensembles, he would make comments about what to do with the music that would draw jazz out of it. And learned a great deal from working in his ensemble. I would say, as far as contact with teachers, maybe that contact with him playing in the ensembles that he was directing. And in those ensembles, just getting to meet people. Like Quincy Jones and I would play together in trumpet sections there. Ray Santisi was going to school, and Charlie Mariano was there at this time. Bob Winter was Bob and Ray and I were all in the same entering class. So the meeting of the people, the after school jam sessions, the rehearsal bands that we organized on our own. During my first semester, the full-time semester in the fall of '50, a saxophone player and I organized a band, and we played gigs, and we both wrote for it. And there was that. The school itself was very encapsulated in the sense that you're protected from the walls. You have the walls of education protecting you from the commercial world, and then even if you did student activity on your own outside of it, you were still somewhat protected. I used to always say to the kids at Berkeley, the walls of education are protecting us. We're doing things here musically that I don't want to say the only value, but the major value is to open up our minds and feelings about this music. These are not practical wage-earning things that we're doing here. So it was a wonderful period, a wonderful growing period, not so much for the classroom time as it was for the association with the other musicians. And meeting a couple of wonderful men. There was a teacher named Bob Scher, who again was not a jazz musician, but I learned a great deal about music from him. Another fellow who was the dean of the school then, Richard Bobbitt. They were the two best classroom teachers that I had there, and my learning from them was not in the jazz genre, but more just about music.
Tell me a little bit about that. What some of the things you felt like you learned, musical values and just whatever.
The musical values, or these?
Yeah. What just you say you learned a great deal about music.
Yeah.
It wasn't specific music or specific jazz, but.
Well, this fellow, Richard Bobbitt, who was the dean, he had studied with Stefan Volpe, and in studying with Volpe, I hope my memory is accurate. Bobbitt learned from studying with Volpe about voicing not through choosing notes because they are the root, the third, the fifth, the seventh, the ninth, but making most of the vertical structures that are created because of the intervallic relationship between the notes, not because they are a function. As far as are you a musician?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So you're fine. That's insulting, and I apologize for just so I don't get boring to you. So that certain intervals, there are consonances, there are dissonances. If we want to get richer, we want to get darker, we want to get brighter, the choice of interval between note is more important than the function that the note is in the chord, which I sort of based the whole course on this later on after I started to teach. Also will take away from the obviousness of the chords that have the root in the bass, from the chords that have the 3/7 tritone that announce I am this chord, and there's very little you can do about it. Instead of taking the notes because they are these very important, vitally important in certain areas of sound, but in this, if you're looking to broaden, whether you're a classical composer or a jazz composer, this approach to intervallic choice of notes rather than function choice of notes, I got originally from Bobbitt, who, to the best of my knowledge, he was teaching me as a result of his studying with Stefan Volpe. And this was actually after I had studied at Berkeley full time, after my 5 semesters, and another trumpet player and I, his name was Herbie Dale, we used to study with Bobbitt after the school day was over privately, just a class of 2. Because I can remember Bobbitt would often come in having had maybe one too many drinks and be out there swinging with it. But I learned a great deal from this man about the intervallic approach to vertical writing as opposed to the function approach.
That's fantastic.
It was to me, even when I'm saying to myself, this is going to be valuable down the road.
I wish I'd had that in college.
Well, I tell you, so many students that I had at Berkeley, I don't mean to wave the flag here, have come back to me 2, 5, 10 years after they, not while they're taking the course, after they absorbed it and said that this course was one of the most opening things for anything they're studying in a school or a classroom situation. It allows, and I have to talk about in the jazz field because I have been I've been very remiss to have been as removed from the classical field as far as activity, playing activity, writing activity, and I regret it now. So I can only talk in terms of jazz, but most jazz ensembles, whether they be 3 or 4 horns in a rhythm section or a whole band, the instrumental sound is pretty similar. I don't mean the harmonic sound.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean the style of the player's vibrato. The purely instrumental sound, when you hear, whether it's four horns in like an octet, or you hear the 12, 13 horns of a full jazz orchestra, the instrumental sound, the layered effect of color of trumpets, color of trombones, color of saxes, in this function kind of harmony that we're talking about, is the same. Whether you listen to Basie of 35, or you listen to Woody of 54, or you kind of listen to Mel and Thad of 85, whichever of these bands, nothing to do with rhythmic style, harmonic style, era, was it swing, was it bebop, was it whatever. This layered, as I call the layer of the colors, and each layer really separated from each other, not entwined, like this, getting a richer sound instrumentally, is the same. Whereas if you use this non-function, this intervallic chord, and put the instruments together, so you rub color against color, put a reed between two brass, rather than put four brass, and then four trombones, and then five saxes, maybe one or two overlapping. I can hear a typical big band, and it almost sounds like they were just the three primary colors, so to speak. I don't hear any sense of rainbow effect going on there. So these are some of the things that I learned from these teachers, which were not jazz tools, but they were music tools.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I knew then, and in hindsight, I even thanked them even more. And then, because so many students, I mean, I've had many people who are professional writers in their homelands, directors of radio, TV, studio bands, conductors of symphony groups who wanted to get into the jazz thing, leaders of big bands all over Europe, who came and studied at Berklee and would take this course, and I could see in their faces while I was saying these things, I could see these looks, these open, that was very gratifying.
Yeah.
To know that I did not invent this. I merely organized the thinking. People say, "Oh, you created it." No, I just, maybe that mathematical mind from, back in my teens and all that allowed me to organize. When you teach as long as I did and stand in front of the thousands and thousands, literally hours, I have stood in front of bands and rehearsed them, and developed an eye-ear relationship. I do not have a God-given eye-ear relationship. I have a developed eye-ear. See the score and hear it in my head. The number of hours that I was able to do that, and I feel very blessed with my own professional band, with the Berklee band, and with the MIT band, and then clinics all around the country and the world and all that. I don't think it's exaggerating to say it's thousands of hours that I've stood there and heard it and seen it. It's allowed me to perceive things about scoring techniques for jazz orchestras that I don't think many people have the opportunity to do. The only person that I've been able to have a close association with, who we've talked about it some, but I knew it from observing him, was Bob Brookmeyer. I think Brooke has the same sort of ability, and he's a marvelous writer. I don't know what kind of thoughts and things Gil Evans had in his head, and I don't know about Duke. I tried to find out from Duke. I played with the band and would question him. It would be terrible. I said, if we were in a room and it was casual, I'd say, Duke, come here. On this tune, in the first two measures, you do this, and I'd play on the piano, but I can't figure out what you do in the next two measures. And he'd say, oh, you're doing it better than I could do it, and just walk away. He wouldn't show me anything, So I kind of rambled there, but it's an important part of my musical life. No
Absolutely.
question.
Backtracking a little bit, when did you start writing your own tunes and stuff?
When I was studying with this Shorty Perry fellow, let's say that would have been 46. I did write some for this high school age dance band that he was the director of. Prior to that, I had tried to do some things on my own. I had no idea what I was doing. It was just laughable. So and then my next training was with this teacher at Berklee at Schilling House in the summer of '48. This man Vic Hogan.
Did you play piano much professionally?
It's funny talking about that just the other day. I've had a terrible cold sore on my lower lip, and I'm supposed to record with Kenny Werner and Bob Moses and John Lockwood Thursday in New York. I've never played with Kenny. Haven't had any association since in school, and he's just playing marvelously. He's just a marvelous young middle-aged jazz piano player. And I've had this cold sore. Again, it totally tuned how poorly my orchestra was conducted. I played 8 gigs 2 weeks ago, and really tore my chops up. And the 8th gig was a 5.5 hour recording session live in a club where I really, with a Beaujolais in Gloucester,
Right,
I worked,
right.
you know, guitar, bass, trumpet. We were doing a live CD, and I really toured them. So last week I had 5 gigs, and I probably played as bad professionally as I played in a few years, as far as the chops go. I could create, I could make the pitch sound, ba, and then it would die. I could not sustain beyond a half note because my lower lip was like a board from this cold. So first you get a knot, and that messes you up. It swells your lips, so the opening in the mouthpiece is closed off with a swollen piece of meat. Then you get the crust, the healing thing, and there's no suppleness, no softness where you want to screw the mouthpiece into your flesh, you know. And I called the fellow who was in charge of the session yesterday and said, I don't know if I can play Thursday. He said, well, I don't know if we're going to have the session. They're going to close all the bridges into New York. He said, you're hearing of this transit strike that's supposed to take place around New York? But anyway, he and I talked, and I said, I'll come, but it could be that you'll send me out to the car and send me home. Now, how did I get into this about chops? There was a question that led me to this thing about this particular chop problem.
Oh, piano. I asked you if you
piano,
played.
yeah.
Yes.
I lost it.
Yeah.
We all lost it for a moment.
Well, the summer of 50, the summer after my year at Harvard, and that was a period where I was really in flux. I was leaving Harvard, the family, at least the dental part, was not too happy. And anyway, I decided I'm going to give up the trumpet, and I played piano all summer long, a trio, alto, drums, and piano at the Dugout, which was in the Hotel Edwards at Salisbury Beach. I mean, really a low-life place, you know. Oh, I made my best friend of life there, a drummer from Lawrence named Joe McGovern, who is my dearest friend. We met there. I played piano all summer. Horribly. So bad that when I went to Schillinghouse in the fall, by that time I decided, hey, I don't play the trumpet as well as I want to, but I play it better than piano. So that's the only time that I've ever really fought for a little while. Now, it's interesting you should ask this right now, because being the age that I am, and the trumpet being the violent physical act that it is, loving music the way I do, my wife saying to me, I don't ever want to know you not playing music. You would be unbelievably impossible to live with if you don't have music in your life. I've been looking around to get a nice, you know, $8,000 or $10,000 piano to put on the porch at the house, because this isn't going to hold up. I've abused this playing incorrectly. And there aren't a lot of guys in their 70s and 80s playing. Clark Terry's still playing. Doc Cheatham played till 91. Yeah. But if you look around, you don't have a lot of 70-something, 80-something-year-old trumpet players. Because it is so, that opening, that we're pushing that air into that tiny opening is ferocious. So I have a feeling that that's what I'm going to end up at being, like a very mediocre, that's a compliment, technique-wise. But you're playing the occasional gig and playing at home, maybe doing some writing. Since I retired, point of view goes, I've not written a note of music because I don't want to be burdened. I've had an offer for quite a few, half a dozen commissions. Money was always good to write something in the jazz idiom, and I don't want to have that thing that when I wake up in the morning, I know I've got a deadline. 2 weeks from today, I've got something. I lived with, as a teacher and a band leader, I lived with, I gotta do this. I wake up in the morning now and have a very nice relation. My wife and I, we've been married 8.5 years, so we're relatively new to each other. We didn't come to we're both in our early 60s when we married. We didn't come with a lot of baggage like most couples. If they get to 60, there's so much baggage. We don't have baggage. We have a lovely marriage, and we have a lovely home in Gloucester. All the children are healthy. The grandchildren are healthy. I really wake up in the morning with a very clear head. I want to work in the yard today. Let's get in the car and go out for Vermont for 2 days. Just check into a bed and breakfast. Let's go to New York and visit the children and the grandchildren. You know, I don't want to have this thing on my head. I've got to write. Mm-hmm. Probably at some point I will get back into writing, but it's the deadline aspect of writing that I don't like. And that's another interesting thing about writing too, just changing the subject sort of. When I was somewhat active as a writer, and this I would pass on to students at Berkeley all the time. If I had a week to write a piece of music, let's say as of Monday I was going to start writing something, and on Saturday morning I had to give it to the copyist. Mm-hmm. And let's say I'm not working on I'm teaching at Berkeley, but not playing it all that week. I get home at night and try all these tricky things and hear all these and change all these things. And all of a sudden I say, oh, it's Friday night and tomorrow morning I've got to give this to the copyists. I now sit down and write as fast as the hand will put the notes on the paper. And let's say I was 50% of the way through. I can't remember the time that what I'm about to say wasn't the case. Maybe once or twice it didn't happen. Invariably, the music that I wrote as fast as my hand would write it down was vastly superior to what I sat there and pondered and, oh, let's try this. And all that.
That's right.
They're just answering to instincts. And I would tell that to students. I see students pondering over 8 bars and perfecting. I say, don't do that. Let me tell you from experience of many years that as fast, I don't, and as a player, I feel the same way. I feel I always play best on the first take if we're going to record. I don't like editing my own thoughts. I believe instinctive musical thoughts in most cases are better. And it's interesting. I find with fellow musicians, the older the musician is, the more they feel this way. The younger the musician, for instance, if I'm leading a recording session now, a jazz-oriented music, and I'm the person in charge, I will offer the license that nobody has to solo until the group or the band has the music totally in order. The engineer has the sound just where we want it, and we're ready to do what, assuming we can, human frailties don't creep in and make mistakes, we can, this is going to be it. The older musicians always accept that. Fine, they'll just sit there and if there's 16 bars solo, they'll rest for the 16 bars. The younger musicians will leap in and play every time, you know. And there's all sorts of psychological reasons for this sort of thing happening.
Yeah. Wow.
But that's sort of the idea. I don't, if I'm playing on a job and you get a request on or a small group playing, the third set you get a request for a tune you played in the first set. You played it in the first set because within the group we chose to play it. You honor the request of the person in the audience. Never do I play as well that second playing because it's still in my head sort of what I played the first time. And I start to play something and I played that before, well, let's go this way. And never is idea B as good as idea A. You know. I'm sorry for digressing.
That's great.
Much.
Those are great digressions. You were growing up in a time you got to see the birth of bebop and some of the more avant-garde jazz movements.
Yes.
What was that like for you and your fellow musicians when you saw this jazz moving away from its kind of dance band orientation?
It's a great question.
Because it's a profound change.
Oh, it's more than just moving away from the dance band. I think it has moved away from the humanistic human elements of the music, or the human elements as I know the human elements. We used to play music that the average lay audience, non-musical knowledge person could react to emotionally. And it seems that so much of what has happened in the last half century, whatever, within the jazz field, requires some idea, some intellectual idea of what's going on, or you just can't get with it. There's too much going on in the head to allow people to do this. And a real good example is that early in jazz, and even up into the 40s, it was music that was played to be both danced to and listened to, which created such a much broader audience. We've narrowed, we've thrown that audience. I was lucky enough to play with Lionel Hampton's band in the early 50s while this was still very much going on. People would come to hear the band and to dance to or listen to, and you would have the X number of rows of people standing in front of the band listening, and behind that this wave of people dancing. Now, not only were you getting to two audiences, but it was inspiring you to play in a dual way. You wanted to be cooking rhythmically for these dances, and you also wanted to be creative and play arrangements that were interesting for the people sitting there looking up and listening, you know. And that dual audience hardly exists in jazz at all at this point.
When you're playing for dancers, it's a different way of connecting than if you have an anonymous sea of people sitting down. I've had that experience before. And when you look somebody in the eye and you know that what you're doing makes a difference.
Yes.
They look you in the eye.
I can play for one person like that if I'm playing in a small club. I mean, my order of, and again I'm digressing, my order of musical integrity is first, here. Second, the musicians I'm working with. And third, anything out there I get is frosting on the cake. And if I see in a small club one person that I feel that their facial expression, their body language, whatever it is getting into what I'm doing, I really work hard at playing for them. But going back to your original question, which is just enormously important for this whole thing, I think this thing, and you said it exactly, it first started in the mid-40s with bebop. I think up until bebop, people could pretty much follow what was going on. By people, I'm talking about your lay audience, be it the dancing or the listening. And I guess we're talking somewhat more about the listening. They could become involved with the emotion of the music because the tools of the music had not become complex to the point that they had. But by the mid-40s, which, I mean, that's right where I made maybe the major shift in my thing. My taste had been Louis Armstrong and the swing bands and Benny Goodman's band, and in 45, one of these Gloucester musicians, whose name I didn't mention, and I should, his name is Andy Boland. He's a drummer. He'd been in the Navy. He came home to Gloucester out of the Navy, and we lived in the same house years ago, and his mother and my mother were friends, so I knew of him. But he was about 7 or 8 years old, and when you're 15, 7 or 8 years is almost like another generation. I mean, a sophomore in high school and somebody who's already been in the Navy, that's two different things. And he always had marvelous integrity as far as what he believed in, and his taste and judgment was excellent. And I'm at my house listening to I was very much into the Dixieland play, the Eddie Condon people. I had all these old red label 78 Commodore records with Pee Wee Russell and Wild Bill Davison and all these, and knew all the tunes, played in Dixieland bands around Gloucester, knew the tunes. I didn't know the idiom well, but I knew it enough to play. And I remember after school going to the local record store and buying, Harry James records for the band and Eddie Condon for the Dixieland and that sort of stuff. And he came to my house some weeks or days after he'd been come home from Gloucester from the Navy. He'd already spent some time in New York on 52nd Street after he got out of the Navy. And he came home to Gloucester with a record of Dizzy and Bird, and on one side was Salt Peanuts, and the other side was Hot House. That tune based on what is a thing called Love, that very complicated bebop had by Tad Dameron. And he came in and he said, "Take this crap off the record, play. This is where it is and this is where it's going." So I put it on his 78 record and listened to both sides, and I thought it was terrible. Naturally, I didn't understand it intellectually, I didn't understand it emotionally, I didn't understand it at all. It was way over my head and my ability to feel. And I said, "Get out of my house. I'm done with this. I'm not going to listen to this. I'm going to listen to what I've been listening to." But 15 is a point in your life where you want to be a part of what's going on. You don't want to be a part of what went on 20 years before. You want to be, right. If that ever changes, I think we have a serious problem. So it didn't take me 20 weeks at home by myself saying, I'm 15, this is the new. So I became a dyed-in-the-wool bebopper. I mean, I left my Bunny Berrigan and my Harry James and my Wild Bill Davison records to get dusty and just couldn't get enough of Dizzy and Bird and the beboppers. I think bebop is a very narrow music. I don't feel it's narrow emotionally, but the tools of bebop are very narrow to me. I've had to undo my beboppedness in the last 20 or 30 years so I could become what I feel is a broader jazz musician. I still, when I'm playing a fast tempo, resort to the bebop licks I learned when I was 15 because I can't create and execute at the tempo anything other than these licks that work that I learned 100 years ago. But they're very narrow licks. And the harmonic vocabulary, it freed us from the relatively simpleness of the swing period harmonies and created a almost worse box that it put us in with these specific chromaticisms and these specific changes of keys. And so I worked very hard at getting away from that. And I'm sort of really rambling about it. It relates to the question to a point, but and then I've never become a part of any avant-garde movement, and I don't think I probably will. I'm sure I won't, because if at this age, pushing 70 in a few months, you've not gone that way, I don't think I'm going to go that way. But that was the one big change in music that I took part in, and took part in to the point of a fault. I wanted to be part of what was hip at that point. For instance, going along these same kind of lines, I had no idea what Duke Ellington was all about at this point. I dismissed Ellington.
Hmm.
I had Count Basie records, Stan Kenton records, God help me, the furthest thing in the world from jazz, like Caucasian Wagnerian crap, okay? And you can print that if you want. And other bands, Woody Herman's band, Dizzy Gillespie's band, let's say those three, Basie, Herman, and Gillespie, all of which were very valid, but none of which had the profundity of Ellington, and I didn't know this. Basie could swing magnificently. Dizzy's band, every time I heard all these new creative bebop licks and harmonies and arrangements, Woody's band saw a combination of the two. And I can remember the instant that a light went off my head. I knew that Ellington, by the time I got to be about 21, I knew that it was over my head. Something there. Too many people who I respect say, listen to this. And I went to hear a battle of bands with Ellington and Basie down in Rhode Island. There's a ballroom just outside of Providence it was called Patuxent on the Roads. I think it still exists. But back in the ballroom days, 30s and 40s and 50s, it was big. And I think I went primarily to hear Basie's band. And on this night, all of a sudden, I was 23 at the time, something went off my head. Oh, there's something more here than there is here. Basie, I was loving and enjoying it for the excitement, the swing, the fire, and all that, the rhythm section. But then I started to see, and that for me was kind of one of these changes, like from the swing period to the bebop period change that I went through in the mid-40s.
I'm sorry, can you recall what it might have been? Would it, orchestration, or the saxophone section? I mean,
to say now, let's see, that was, what was that? That's 46 years ago. To say now, I don't think would be an honest memory of what did happen in that very moment. It would be what I've come to know since then, and I started to talk about that life. I want to say it had to do with that coming out of the Ellington band was the sum total of 15 or 16 human beings, each being themselves. But I came to know that later, so I'd like to think that I reacted that way then.
Yeah.
I probably was not consciously reacting that way. I referred to in my teaching that most of the other bands were sort of push-button bands. The leader said, do this, and do it to this level of competency, and you'll get a week's pay. And that's an awful, terrible way of simplifying it. With Duke's band, he just says, okay, play.
Yeah, they're all soloists.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even within the ensemble, they weren't improvising as far as the pitches, but they're feeling their sound. I mean, with Ellington, within the sax section, it is not 5 saxophones trying to blend with the lead player. It's 5 individuals totally being themselves as far as expression, to the point that by certain standards of accurate section of the instruments playing, it was bad. But it allowed to be, the sum total of 5 people is so much greater than the sum total of 5 saxophonists. And I don't think I'd realized that. I think I just, at age 23, I was beginning to open up to there's more to what my previous 8 years of semi-professionalism had been leading me to.
During your student years, were you familiar at all with, there was an MIT jazz band called the Tectonians. Were you familiar with them, and what was their reputation around town?
I was not familiar with them until the first day I rehearsed over here, which takes us ahead a little, takes us to 63. Maybe you talk a little bit about that way, but the name Klaus Liebman, historically, did you know Klaus? You're not that old,
didn't know him, no. But
I was teaching at Berkeley in the early spring, late winter of 63, and Berkeley was such a small little school then that there were phones in the corridors outside of many classrooms, so the phone rang, so the teacher would go out and answer it. This gig, Ray Santee, you can hear you pound on the floor, you got a gig tomorrow night, Ray, on the phone, very family-oriented, small school thing. So the phone rang, and this, I answered it, and this very foreign, I guess Germanic, I guess Klaus was German, was he?
yes.
Yeah. I shall not try to imitate his work. He said, I'm Klaus Liebman, Director of Music at MIT. We have a band here at MIT that is so bad, he said, that I've told them to disband, or if they want to continue, do not use the name MIT to be associated with. It was kind of funny. And Klaus was great. Klaus was very helpful. He didn't understand what I was doing, but I think he knew we were doing it well, or something like that.
Yeah.
So he said a couple of the young men in the band said they would like to have the MIT Music Department hire a director so that the band could get, because it was student director there. There had been an adult director that I'll move back to a moment that they used to tell me about, some of the older student band. But he said they'd like to have a director, and they mentioned your name. And at this point, I didn't know any of the young men who mentioned it, but I had been active with my band from 55 to this point in the Boston jazz scene. So he said, I'd like you, if you're interested, to come over here, and if you would, they rehearsed on Sunday afternoons. He said, for the remaining 6 Sundays of the semester, work with them, and then at the end of that period, tell me that if you'd like to continue next year or if you wouldn't. And I can remember what he told me. He said it'll be $30 a session for these Sunday rehearsals, and I can remember that. It was a very important thing in my life, as it turned out. The time I spent here. So I said sure, and I can remember sitting in my car on a warm, sunny April afternoon. You could drive in with a chapel, a circular chapel. Those roads you could drive in. I remember parked right by the chapel, going into credit, and I got there early, so I didn't want to go in before I was scheduled to be in there, and I went to wait until 3 o'clock when I'm due, and thinking, oh, what am I doing here, So I went in, and the kids were great, and the night before they'd had their annual spring concert, so I figured they're going to be in pretty good shape. I mean, good timing, the day after they've just had a concert. And at this point, they're student-led, no faculty, no adult leader. And I said, well, why don't you play something for me? And I even remember the tune. I remember the arrangement.
What was the tune?
The tune was You Took Advantage of Me. It was an arrangement by Nat Pierce. They may probably have gotten through the Berkeley Library or something. And it was horrible. I mean, it was just vilely horrible. And I hope I'm not exaggerating. Let's say this was a 3-minute arrangement, all right? During this arrangement, I am deciding, am I just going to say, guys, I think this is not right for me and right for you, and I'm sorry to have taken your time, but we won't do this. Or shall I say, yeah, let's do something with it. So in that 3 minutes, I made this decision that I ended up 22 years, and now you're following through as Jamshid did and as Jim did, But I sensed something. It certainly wasn't quality music. I sensed something. And I don't know what I sensed even, but I'm hoping it wasn't just $180 for 6 Sundays at $30 a whack or something like that. So I said, okay, let's get into this arrangement, and I stuck it out for the 6 Sundays, and I could then begin to see that I was going to learn a great deal about people, because it was a not different level of human being, different level of where these young men were in their heads from where the Berkeley students were in their heads. I'd be getting paid, but I was going to be learning. Because these people came to it as an outlet to get away from the stress of what they were doing the rest of their time. The Berkeley kids are coming to it every day with the stress of, I hope I can make it in this field, I got to make a living and all that sort of thing. And it was so totally different. It was almost like it wasn't music with MIT, music with Berkeley. It was like 2 different elements, 2 different situations. The way the people here brought themselves to the music. And it came to be not too many years that I was more proud of what I was doing here on a part-time basis, 5 hours a week, than I was teaching full-time at Berkeley. Because I sensed that these people, the point they were starting at and the point they would end up at in a school year was so great compared to the point where the Berkeley recording band started at, with all these worldwide professionals getting a little bit better. And I could see that they, the MIT student and me coming together, were really doing something that you don't often in life get a chance to build like that. Yeah.
Wow. Well, for the next interview, we'll get more into the MIT thing, but that's a beautiful lead-in. One more question. I know you have to leave at 12:30 here. The Boston jazz scene in the 30s and 40s. Is there any kind of reflections or anything you any way you want to kind of describe that? And
You say, of the 30s and 40s?
yeah.
Well, I didn't know the jazz scene of the 30s at all, other than through hearing older musicians, older than me later on, in the 50s and 60s, talk about it. I remember going to a club in 41 called the Ken Club with my mother and hearing Hot Lips Page, a great old legendary jazz player. But I didn't know much about it. I remember listening to the radio in the early 40s. Do you gentlemen know of Nat Hentoff, the writer? Yeah,
Yes.
Nat was the jazz writer person in Boston, and had on WESX had a weekly radio show. And if they did live radio broadcasts out of the Savoy, he would MC it. Nat was important here in the 40s in Boston, and I would always listen to his radio show. He would write columns. George Fraser was writing. Do you know the name George Fraser? Great old columnist, very always stirring up things. Wrote for the Boston Herald. The Herald was then a very conservative Republican, nothing like it is now. I mean, now it's like a rag.
Yeah.
But there used to be the Herald would be the morning and the Traveler would be the evening paper of the Herald Traveler, and then with decades later they joined up with the Record American, and then finally just became whatever it became. But anyway, he wrote for the Herald, George Fraser, and had a great column, and was very into writing about jazz. This is early 40s, because I can remember reading a column he wrote shortly after my mother bought me the trumpet, and I was really into Harry James. And he had an article in the Herald about that Harry James could not carry Louis Armstrong's trumpet case in the door of the gig. And I was ferocious, because I hadn't come to realize that Louis Armstrong is the single figure in American jazz to this point. If you have to say one guy has done it, he did it, okay? But at that point, I'm listening to Harry James playing Cherry Berry Dee Da and Carnival of Venice and all this kind of stuff, so I was very defensive. But Fraser was a great writer. I didn't know the musicians personally at all. I was a high school kid and grammar school kid in Gloucester. I came to know some of them who were active in the 30s and 40s when I became involved with the 50s scene. But by the time I became involved with the 50s scene, I was a bebopper. And these older musicians, the vast majority of them, if not every one of them, were still swing-oriented, and us beboppers were looking down our nose because we were playing the music of the times, and they were still playing that old stuff, Trying to think of any musicians of that era that I knew personally. Well, Ruby Braff was in the tail end. I remember hearing Ruby in the mid-40s at the Savoy. Ruby's about 5 years old, so when I'm 15, he's 20. And he was playing with some of the older, the Vic Dickinson types. They were not Boston people, but they were national jazz people that come into the Savoy. The Savoy was sort of the leading jazz club back in the late 30s and early 40s. And then it brought the national, I call them mainstream now, but the national swing era people, Roy Eldridge and people like that in there. But I really, my knowledge of the 30s and 40s is one of hearsay, talking to other people, not taking part in. I mean, my having lived day to day, very, very intensely a part of the scene is the 50s on. Yeah.
Wow.
That might be a good place to
There's one name we never got to. When you asked me about MIT and the Tectonians, the young men in the band that I took over in '63, who had maybe been in that band, and it was called the Tectonians. I mean, that was the name of it. We changed that fairly quickly to the first we called the MIT Concert Jazz Band, and then when we got into having the two bands, we made the distinction. There was the Concert Jazz Band and the Festival Jazz Band. The festival band went to the various festivals. The concert band was Everett's band, which just played the concerts here.
Okay.
But the men who were in the band, and then I took on '63, there were some grad students in the band then who'd been in the band in the late '50s, talked about an ROTC instructor who Major somebody who led the dance band back in the 50s, whether it was mid or must have been more like late 50s for these people that I was having contact with in '63, and they laughed about him because he wasn't really jazz oriented. He was more like an ROTC guy, but that he led them in whatever way he did lead them, and they would, in the nicest way, would make fun of it. You know, he really didn't have any idea what he was doing. I've forgotten his name. Now, somewhere deep in my archives, and I don't mean to tease you and then fail you, I have some programs that people gave me way back then, or back into the 50s, and his name is probably on it, but I honestly don't know where to start. Our attic, you must realize, my wife and I have been married for 8.5 years. I had the house in Gloucester, which had was a summer home, and then in '83, my son and I moved out of our Brookline apartment into there. My wife lived in an apartment in Arlington, and when we got married, we decided the way to start a marriage is not in my house or your house, but we got an apartment in the Prue, which I recommend for any middle-aged couple getting married. Don't live in his or her house. Live in our house. It really worked good. We have two very close couples got married at the same time we did. They're both divorced. And we think it's part of it. That when we got this apartment in the Prue, which was convenient for me at Berkeley, and she taught administrated at Bentley, it was our place from the beginning. So we had her apartment in Arlington, which she had to clean out. We had my apartment in Brookline we cleaned out. A lot of that went into the apartment in the Back Bay, and a lot of it went into the summer home that we came up with. I winterized in '83. And we have so much in our attic from these various houses that it is terrible. So I don't mean to tease you with it exists, but whether I can lay my hands on this stuff.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
She has boxes and boxes of professional and personal clippings and stuff, and quite possibly in the professional boxes. If I ever had the part of me doesn't like to go back. I love to live for the day and tomorrow. I don't like to live for the past.
Yeah, that's wise.
Well, I want to thank you very, very
my
much
pleasure.
for this.
It's fun talking about these things. It really
great.
is.
And I look forward to some
Yeah.
meetings in the spring.
Yes.
Very good.
Yes.
If you wanted to do it once between now and when I leave, I'd be happy. I leave on January 9th. My wife and I go away for 2+ months. So between now and the 9th, I'm sure sometime after, between Christmas and the 9th, I could, excuse me, get together again if you gentlemen want to, or
I'll
if you
have to
just
look at
want
my
to wait.
schedule and I can get back to you. Can you? Oh, I think your your phone number is right here.
Yeah, great.
Okay.
The nice thing, it might be tough to organize, but the nice thing about that is that when that springtime, with everything going on, we're doing, it could get a little tight. It might be nice to, if we only had to do one then as opposed to two, that would
Right. Right.
Let me make sure I'm telling you the right dates. I hate the end of the year to carry 2 books with me. It's terrible. Yeah, we're leaving Sunday the 9th of January.